Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show. I am your host, Steve McAllister. Some 15 months ago now, former Canadian national women's soccer team player Diana Matheson and a company called Project 8 delivered some news during the ESPNW Summit in Toronto that a new women's professional soccer league was coming to the True North Strong and Free. The Northern Super League was created with 6 franchises in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Halifax, Vancouver, and Calgary. The league raised the curtain on its inaugural regular season back on April 16th when the Vancouver Rise eked out a 1-0 win over the Calgary Wild at BC Place. 5 months into the season, we wanted to have someone from the league join us to talk about the wins, the challenges, and the opportunities in the fast-expanding world of not only women's sport, but sport across the board. And yes, of course, there's a wagering component to that. So without further ado, we welcome to the podcast the president of the Northern Super League, Christina Litz. Hey, Christina, this is a long overdue conversation for you and I to have together, but thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to see you, Steve, and to be here with you this morning.
Hey, the first question, and it's an easy one, is, for a young woman attending the University of Manitoba's law school back in the day, and we won't give a year for that. Did you ever dream that you would one day not only be president of a women's professional sports league, but that there would even be a professional women's sports league where you could carve out any kind of a career?
Yeah, Steve, the short answer is no, not at all. Partly was sort of my career aspirations at the time were really different, as I think is the case with a lot of kids just coming out of high school and into university, so yeah, I actually went into law school thinking that I was going to be a constitutional lawyer and be arguing big charter cases at the Supreme Court. But it was funny, just around that time too. I actually started, writing. I always loved writing in high school, and so I started, writing for the university newspaper, the Manitoban, for those who are from that part of the world, and then did some writing on pop culture and entertainment for the Winnipeg Free Press. And it was around that time that I really, started thinking that maybe constitutional law wasn't going to be the thing that I was going to do. But no, you at that time, and it is a long time ago, but in the big scheme of sports, not that long, I suppose, which just goes to show what's happened in our industry. There was no sign that professional women's sports was going to be a thing. I mean, really, which doesn't mean, by the way, that we didn't have all these incredible role models and there weren't these amazing athletes happening, but you tended to only see them every 4 years at the Olympics. Maybe around that time, tennis was kind of starting to set the scene for thoughts that men and women could do things equally when it came to sports. So no, and really for me professionally, the idea of working in sports was never on my radar because there was never, I mean, certainly not in Winnipeg, but even once I moved to Toronto, which I did right after law school, there were really no role models to speak of and no thoughts that women could work in sports. And so it kind of took other people to see that maybe this was a place that I could work in, and inviting me in that got me working in this crazy business. And that sort of happened when I had made the transition from law to business, and I was working at that time at Chorus Entertainment doing digital and content and social media, ironically, primarily for women's lifestyle content. I had done a little bit of sports content when I was at Rogers just before that. But, my connection with sports was being a super fan and being an expat Winnipegger in Toronto, cheering the return of the Winnipeg Jets to the NHL and getting together with our Winnipeg expat friends in Toronto to watch, Bombers games and Grey Cups. But I got a call from the recruiter from the CFL. And at that time, they were looking for somebody to lead broadcast and help them think about digital media and digital content. And I was invited in to meet Mark Cohan, who was the then commissioner, and Mike Copeland, the president there. And in a way, it kind of scared the bejesus out of me, the whole thing. But I was also, as a content person and a digital person at the time, and looking for ways to sort of expand experience, which is something I always encourage, young people to think about. When you looked around content and digital at the time in Canada, 10 years ago or so, it was around the time when the NHL had just done their, massive deal with Sportsnet. You kind of looked around at all the heads of the major media companies at the time, and it was Phil King and Keith Pelly, and they all came from sports. And then, you just saw what sports was doing online for content. And I had this notion that, even if I failed tremendously at it, boy, what an experience it would be to be there and give it a shot. And so that's kind of when I made the jump, and with the vision then of Mark Cohan, who really wanted to modernize the way the CFL was presenting itself, and wanted to be thinking about much more than about the avid fan in the CFL. That was something I felt I could contribute to and be a part of, and bring my voice. So I could learn. It was a super casual fan of the CFL at the time, but the actual game and all the mechanics and the ins and outs of actual football, that can be learned. And maybe it's the training as the lawyer, where you have to learn your client's business really, really quickly when you come on. And so that's what I did, and that's how I came over. And then the notion of women's sports still took many years after that, but I felt it the whole time that I was at the CFL. And then eventually, when I moved over and moved back to Winnipeg to go work with True North and the Winnipeg Jets, especially when you got over to the hockey side, you just kind of wondered why the attention was only being paid to the one side of the game, and knowing what kind of athletes were out there and the level of compete. And I went over to True North at a time when, the beginning thoughts of the PWHL were there, and they had the couple of leagues that were trying to figure out how they were going to move forward with it. But there was still just a general non-belief amongst industry leaders and media leaders and sponsorship folks that this ever could be a thing. And then the PW came out in Canada and proved them all wrong, and showed that audience, especially in Canada, had been there all along. And if you decided to put it on television in a good spot, and if you decided to put proper resources behind it, so it looked great, and you could bring in the best athletes that you could, lo and behold, like other men's sports, it could work. And so so that was really, for me, the first time where I was getting really excited about potentially one day being able to maybe lend a little bit of my experience and background to helping make this be. And it was about that time that I got a call from Natalie Cook, who was ex-TSN president, who was helping Diana Matheson at the time, and then met Diana. And that's a long way of saying, how did I get to this?
Was there one piece of those conversations that you had with Natalie or Diana, Christina, that made you believe in Diana's vision and that this league could work?
It really was. First of all, I knew Natalie for many years because of my time at the CFL and then at the Jets, and she was somebody that I just still immensely respect, and she knows her business, and so first of all, having her believe made me believe. And then when you meet Diana Matheson, and just see how committed she is, and the work that she put into it, Plus, she just has a quality about her that is truly what you see in the greatest of leaders and makes you want to run through a wall, honestly. But there was that sort of that kind of inspiration. But the reality was their business plan, her and Tom Gilbert, who was her business partner at the time and is now the CEO of the Ottawa Club, um, they had a really, really sound business plan. They had spent, Diana almost underplays the story of saying, she went to school and she went behind the scenes and she studied this and that. Well, first of all, Diane is a Princeton grad and, went on scholarship to Queen's to do her MBA and spent, years in Europe working with a UEFA academy. Like she had years of workshopping this and studying the business of women's soccer to a degree I doubt anybody has done. And it showed in the planning that they were doing and the sound decisions that were being made, different approaches to how they were thinking about media, how they were thinking about bringing franchises or ownership in around the table. And so that was it. And I started kind of working behind the scenes when it was Project 8, and it was really the notion of we have this idea. They had just brought the 6 ownership groups around the table. Now can you bring it to life with us? And so that was my role. And yeah, off we go.
It feels like timing's everything too, right, Christina? And it just feels like they're really, I'm not sure it's a catalyst for this, but suddenly there certainly was a groundswell of support for women's sport on the broadcast side, on the sponsorship side. Canadian Tire stepped up in a big way for the Northern Super League early in the process. We've seen the impact that Caitlin Clark's had on the WNBA, and that was a league that's been around for 25 plus years, but it felt like that league took a quantum leap forward with Caitlin's arrival on the scene. And then I also wonder how much influence the early success of the PWHL had on Diana and Tom and people like yourself, that this was the right time to launch this league.
Yeah, I think it was actually, well, in one sense, I still want to say it was 15 years too late. Like, same with PW and really, did WNBA need 30 years to be an overnight sensation? No. But that's okay. Let's go from where we are. But yeah, I think there were a lot of signs that we had to go, and we had to go now, and it was the right time to go. And like I said, definitely the PWHL, I think, proved to the people that make up the systems of sports that the business could work. And so that, again, it meant that media folks were open to conversations with us, and we now have broadcast deals with TSN, RDS, CBC, Radio Canada. And I don't know that those conversations would necessarily have gone the way they did without PW. And then, March Madness, then with Caitlin Clark, certainly also, led to a flurry of, writing and activity around the value and growth. And we started to see signs in the soccer world, especially just to the south of us with the NWSL, around rising valuations on their franchises. And again, some of the economics, the underlying economics, attendance, ratings, we're starting to really hit a critical mass. And so all of those things open doors. I would say it was still, it's still really, really challenging to put together a business framework when there's nothing before. So we had to do a lot of work. For example, we worked closely with Wasserman at the time to kind of talk about, how do we talk to sponsors about something that was nothing? How do we value properly what we're doing, not being too aggressive in the market, but also not underselling ourselves, given what was starting to happen around the world. So there's that. And then I think also important to us was just the calendar of soccer, football internationally, and knowing that Men's World Cup is coming in 26, and on the women's side, where there's always, when you have international competition like World Cup or Olympics, there's always a knock-on effect to whatever professional league exists in that country. So Women's World Cup coming in 27 in Brazil, and then we have an Olympics in LA a year later, which is essentially home soil. So it's, if we could get up and running, like at the time we were like, if we can do this, if we can go out imperfectly, which I think all good startups do, and just get out there and make it happen. We couldn't wait any longer. Like and it was really important for Diana and the teammates from her national team on whose behalf she's really doing this, that this league got started, by players, essentially with players in mind, with a group of owners around the table who really understood the underlying why of all of what we were doing. And so, again, launched with some unknowns and not having all of our sponsors at the table, but some true believers and loose, agreements on partnerships. And then we spent a year after announcement just hustling to get the league staff, the team staff, and players signed, and all the things that go with it, to then eventually kick off in this past April.
And I think just from a pure sport standpoint too, Christina, the timing for this league was really important because, we've it does feel with the women's soccer program in this country, we're at a point, Christine Sinclair is retired now, and I wonder how much longer Quinn's going to be around. And there is a bit of, Kadisha Buchanan is an experienced player now, and it seems like it was only yesterday she was, I think an 18 or 17 or 18-year-old rookie. And there does seem to be a changing of the guard, and I think we're seeing the same thing with women's hockey. Like Marie-Philippe Poulin probably has one more Olympics in her, and so I think as a league that's while it is a professional league, it's also an important development tool for that next generation of World Cup and Olympic soccer stars as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and some people may have heard the story that Diana talks about, that at the last World Cup that she competed in 2016, it was out of the 32 countries that were competing in that tournament, it was only Canada and Haiti that didn't have a domestic women's professional league. And so, in a way, the success of the current women's national team really hasn't followed the playbook. And there's just been, some outstanding talent, some outstanding coaching, that I think, again, not being an expert in the sport, others have said, were contributing factors, like, and generational players like Christine Sinclair and others on that club. But if we want to continue and go further and win a World Cup, I think it's widely agreed by all soccer experts, including the current, new national team coach, Casey Stoney, that will not happen without a league like ours. And so that is a goal for us. And we want to see ideally a third of our players on that national team as we go into 27. We already have an incredible group in year one. Of course, some of those veterans like Quinn and Desi Scott at the beginning of the year, who played her last game with the national team, and then Erin McLeod before that, who again, this was their dream, right, for this to happen, and they wanted to contribute their voice. But oh boy, there's some good talent coming up, and we have current national team players, Emma Regan, Holly Ward. There's a phenom coming out of Toronto, Kaylee Hunter, who, if you're not paying attention to her, you should be, just 17, and she's fierce, and every week, and our leading goal scorer, Dee Pridham in Ottawa, every week we are discovering, we're seeing what our future national team is going to look like, and the future is very, very bright. And right now, Coach Casey Stoney, she's actually doing a bit of a tour. You can see on our social media right now that Casey was just in Ottawa and then Montreal this last weekend, spending some time with the teams, understanding how we're set up, the tremendous investment that our ownership group has made to facilities and staff and training. And we really want to work with Canada Soccer to help this country win gold, win a World Cup. And I think they're looking forward to helping ensure that we continue to grow and be a source of pride for the country, because of course, soccer, football, it's international.
Just wonder, Christina, in the inaugural season, just how things have gone from a business standpoint as so far in terms of attendance and television ratings. And I think again, I think digital is an important part. I think one thing that gets overlooked too often today is that everybody just looks at the TV numbers, and we live in a digital world, and certainly our children live in a digital world, and then the the response from corporate Canada as well.
Yeah, no, I think we're happy with where things are at. We are just in the middle of doing our mid-season reports with our partners. We set out for ourselves, as any good business should, some key performance indicators for this first season. That when we look 3 years down the road, we hope to seriously accelerate. But happy to report that we're kind of where we wanted to be. Of course, we had that first big month and some good, big ratings on TSN and CBC and Radio Canada and RDS in those first opening games. But really, the goal of women's sports has to be to go from those moments, one big game, one big opening, to the regular week by week and on ticket sales and ratings. And that's hard. It's just hard, and it's a grind, and it takes a lot of money and a lot of marketing. But we're happy. We're averaging about 4,000 a game right now. And for example, we had a great match at Toronto took a flyer and going back to BMO and 7,700 people. And in the world of women's football, that is a big number. And it shows, again, with they always put more resources into games like that, with the marketing shine, with the venue and where it is. People want to be there. They want to show up. But generally happy overall. I'm not happy, Steve. I'm personally not happy until I see our numbers on the big league level. And same with ratings. Again, we're happy. I think we've received some great feedback from TSN on where we're at in the big scheme of things, and really happy with those numbers there. But I want NHL numbers. I want CFL numbers. I want those. And I'm being told that I have to be a little bit more patient. But decent numbers for a first year. Our sponsors are happy. I think on that front, we have a group of partners around the table who understand that this is an investment, that it's going to take time, but are reporting some how happy they are and how they're already seeing it make a difference to decisions that their customers are making. That was shared, to us by DoorDash, and hoping, to get some more information on that soon. But we, that backs up some of the data that, IMI and Wasserman and others, Canadian Women in Sports have said that really brands that support women's sports, there's a higher affinity, a higher loyalty from customers to, for brands who do that. And that's truly what we're seeing, and we're hearing from our key partners. But boy, we're happy with the group around the table right now. And at the risk of missing somebody, from Canadian Tire to Toyota to Coke to WestJet, Intact, DoorDash. It's Simon's, which has been a fun partnership. It's an incredible group, and of course BMO as well, who's supporting our broadcast. And they're truly a partner of ours around the table, who have that shared vision, who believe that men's and women's sports should be invested in equally, should be treated equally. We have to do our part and prove that we can get to those numbers, but they bought into the plan. They understand, we're in this for the long haul, and we love working with them.
You mentioned how difficult it is, and you couldn't be more right. I mean, I remember going to work at Tennis Canada in the early 90s, and the tennis ratings for the Canadian Opens back then were so low that Tennis Canada actually took over paying for the production of the tournaments in Montreal and Toronto on TSN, and then going out and selling, building sponsorship packages that included television commercials. And you look at, the recent National Bank Open and Victoria Mboko winning, and all the interest and hoopla around that. And it feels to me like you kind of have a special insight into that from your experiences at Woodbine Entertainment, where we know horse racing is in a much bit different place in 2025 than it was 25 years ago. Working in the CFL, where, I covered the CFL in the 80s, where we wondered if the league was going to shut down at some point. And then also your time at True North, where, you have both an NHL and an AHL franchise in town. And anytime the Jets take a step backwards, there's some hand-wringing about attendance and television ratings and what's the future of that franchise going to be. And then for an AHL team competing in an NHL market. So it feels like there's kind of a been there, done that component to your career.
I know I should go someplace a little bit more stable, shouldn't I? No. You know what? No, there's actually, first of all of those are tremendously stable industries, but I love being in a place where you can think outside the box and use creativity and innovation to facilitate growth. And I think that's at all of those places, there was a willingness and openness to do that, and in some cases maybe out of necessity for where the industry was at, but also I have to give credit to the leadership of all of those places for understanding the tremendous change that is happening and has been happening in the sports industry. Again, at one point, not too recently, you were thinking about newspapers and a television and selling a ticket. And now, you're thinking about multiple screens. You're thinking about multiple ways of presenting content out of a recognition that, your customer, your fan demographic is so diverse, and growth comes for all of those sports, for all of sports, in identifying new fan segments that have maybe not been invited into traditional male sports before, have not been particularly welcome. And when you recognize that with some change, with some different ways of producing content, social, digital, how you do events, and how you kind of understand, which is something I really learned at the CFL, that in a way, as long as the gameplay is great, your avid fans are generally happy and they're going to be there. Don't take them for granted, because they're incredibly important, and the CFL understood that. But they also wanted to ensure that league was going to be around for decades to come. And so they understood, when we thought of doing, crazy digital content with Whistle Sports, where we wanted to do Thursday night football with music, where we wanted to, bring off-season events and things like that, like just thinking differently only grows your business. And, I think, again, on the Woodbine front, that's such a fascinating industry. My time there, I initially started there actually helping them out with sports betting, single event sports betting strategy, understanding how disruptive that was potentially going to be to the horse racing industry. But conversely, they also wanted to understand the opportunity around that. And I was watching with interest at the Kings played this weekend, and lots of my former CFL friends there right now, and what an event that has turned into. Like, it's just the coolest place to be. They've done some amazing, renovations and customer experience, and I think I read that they were on they were doing single event sports betting on horse racing this weekend, which in that industry years ago would never happen. But they know that is where that next generation is going to be, and you have to be where they are. You can't just expect them to come to you, and that's the big thing in sports marketing and growth that I think I've learned the most in all of those areas.
I'd like to spend a few minutes on sports betting, Christina, because actually this conversation with us today kind of came about a LinkedIn exchange we had, I think a week or so ago, and something we've talked about in this podcast often. We've had people from FanDuel on the show. We've talked to other leaders in women's sports like yourself, and the getting sports leagues into sports books is important. I mean, I've been to conferences over the past 4 years where I've heard people from the NFL and the NBA, Major League Baseball, Keith Wachtel from the NHL has talked about this, is that there is a correlation between television ratings and fan engagement and people betting on sports. And I remember quite vividly the sports betting executive from the NFL speaking at the Next IO conference in New York, I think 3 years ago now, and talking about people were watching broadcasts longer because they had, pardon the bad pun, skin in the game with a sports bet on a game they normally might not watch on a Sunday afternoon. And for women's sports, because a lot of these leagues are new, like the Northern Super League, there is a challenge with data and archive data, and so when you look, funny, I did some research for this podcast, and a lot of the sports books, they are offering women's leagues in places like Brazil and Colombia and England, where there have been women's leagues for a while. It's hard to find on the sportsbook apps. You have to do a lot of digging to get down there and find those leagues. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about the efforts of the Northern Super League to get partnerships with sportsbooks and to get your league in front of those sportsbooks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start it off with, sort of acknowledging, your statement and essentially agreeing with it, that again, in the notion of, the philosophy of you have to be there, we knew from the get-go we needed to essentially be in a place to set up the systems to make sure that we were ready for that part of the business if and when it came. So from the very beginning, we ensured that data was a focus in the build of what we were doing. And so very early on, we partnered with Stats Perform Okta to help set up our stats, and really part of that discovery and in looking at that, and had so much experience diving into the building of stats and systems at the CFL, was ensuring that they were going to be a good partner to essentially license our feeds to the sports books and get there. And so they've been a good partner, and if you go to our website on any given game day, we have the live tracker, the live stats coming in. There's a ton of data being collected both through that and through other sports data partners that are working with the sports side. So we're ready to go on that front. I would say it's still been a challenge. We're having some good conversations now, but to your point, I think my high level observation is that with few exceptions, that part of the industry is still trying to figure out where we fit in, and women's sports in general, and how to market us. And I think, again, I'd love your 2 cents on that. I think they get sometimes tripped up on who the fan is, and one, make the assumption that maybe women's sports fans aren't going to participate in this book, and at the end of the day, they have to, make money, and they have to grow their side. So I think that's part of the hesitation, without realizing, using us for an example, that on TSN, still the vast majority of people tuning in are men. And so, there's some education that has to be done on that. And then just figuring out where everybody sits in the ecosystem and the windows. And that was something I learned, for example, at the CFL, when we were going through the exploration of sports betting, and recognizing, within the calendar year of a sports book, there are different highlights. And for CFL, there was this nice little window of opportunity in the summer when there was, I think it was the MLB break, where nothing else was happening, and people were looking for things to bet on. Well, guess what? We're playing during that break too. So, and we have our games showing across the world, and real-time stats feeds and data. So there's good conversations going on. I think with some of the companies, there's an awareness, and they're seeing the opportunity. Again, like sports, we've been showing time and time again that if you pay some mind to this, to diverse customers, and look for ways of inviting people in, people are anxious to be there, and understanding that, for us, it's very important from a values point of view that this not take over our sport, and the integrity of our game will always be the utmost importance in setting this up, and we will always be advocates for responsible gaming. It can also, within limitations, be a fun way to follow a game, and we want to be a part of that. So we're having some conversations. We're still looking, but I still think there's room in this country, North America generally, where we could be leaders. Because in sports, in North America, the research shows that North American fans love women's sports. So maybe the rest of the world, there's catching up to do, and I've really noticed that in my travels in the UK and in Mexico, where you think football is so much further ahead, soccer is so much further ahead than us here. There's still things in terms of attitudes and the legacy of men's football and soccer that is preventing this from truly, living up to what it should. So, my invitation to those in North America is let's show everyone there's a business here, and that this is an opportunity for growth, because Canadian fans, North American fans, are definitely buying in.
Yeah, I would say, Christina, the feedback I've had when I talk to traders of sports books in the past is that that they're going to offer products that customers want. So if there's a demand for it, they'll step up. And again, this is a new league, so it feels like this is a marathon, not a 100-meter sprint. And then I think there's also, what we saw with Caitlin Clark, and even with the MLS with Lionel Messi arriving in Miami, is that there is a certain star power that is attractive to sports books as well. And I think sports books reported an unbelievable increase in betting action when Clark joined the WNBA, and even going back to Caitlin's time in the NCAA in Women's March Madness. And then we've also seen some encouraging numbers from the Women's Euro tournament this summer, where Bet365 reported a huge uptick in betting activity thanks to the women's tournament. You mentioned kind of that soft place in the sports calendar, and for Bet365, and I think a couple of operators, the Women's Euro tournament filled that need. So yeah, there's definitely credibility there.
I think the only thing I would challenge you on that, or the folks that are saying that they're living to the customer, is to what the customer wants, or serving what the customer wants. Like, even with the story of Caitlin Clark, the systems had to be there to support the story of Caitlin Clark. She's not the first woman basketball player that has played like she has played. She has some extra magic, sure, but there have been incredible women basketball players before her. The difference in that tournament was the storytelling around Caitlin Clark, the time that the broadcast was happening, the news reporters that showed up to cover it, the brands that were saying to, everybody, we want to hear more about this. And so that actually takes conscious decision action. Same as our partners coming in at the get-go, same as Ally Financial, who said to the broadcasters of the NWSL, we are cutting back advertising unless you put NWSL in primetime. Like, that is what has to happen. And again, we have to do our job on the property side to make sure that we are developing a quality product. But you have to make decisions to invest. You have to make decisions to give real estate, put it in places where it can be discoverable, storytell around it. We can't do that all on ourselves. So I think that's the only thing I would say to that, because that argument sometimes sounds to me like what they said about women's sports, why it wasn't on broadcast a few years ago. They would put it on if people would just say they wanted it. Well, not that easy.
Yeah, and I also think too, and this is something I've spoken to operators about, Christina, is I think there's an opportunity through women's sports leagues to do a better job for the operators that have ambassadors talking about responsible gambling. I think that's been somewhat of a failure, and we see it here in Ontario, where with partnership deals where we see lots of commercials featuring athletes. I mean, no longer since the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario changed the rules. But I felt there was a missed opportunity to use those ambassador deals to really lean heavily into responsible gaming. You've got two franchises in Ontario right now with Toronto and Ottawa, where you could have a Delaney Pridham or a Kaylee Hunter, being an ambassador for a sports book, and those athletes are allowed to deliver responsible gaming messaging. So there is an opportunity there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the magic with women's sports and emerging leagues like ours. We can set the rules differently. And of course, it's so aligned with the values and what we're trying to do to be role models to that next generation. So all to say, I agree with you and welcome those conversations with any books that want to have them.
Hey, Christina, final question. What gets you excited when you wake up in the morning now and you log on? I was going to say when you go to the office, but we're all working in a remote environment these days. So, when you log onto your computer in the morning, what kind of gets you excited right now about the Northern Super League?
Well, I think like maybe some other people listening, I have an unhealthy connection to my device. And so don't judge me when I say the first thing I do is look at social media when I wake up with my morning coffee. I love seeing our athletes share their stories about what's happening with this league. And again, women athletes have been in a position where they've had to tell their own story because nobody else will. But boy, the story is a lot of fun right now. So I love opening Instagram and I follow, as many of our players as possible and seeing them share their highlight goals, seeing them share their walk-ins into the stadiums, the fun social media that they're doing, and interactions with young fans, boys and girls, which is so exciting. To me, that validates all the hard work and the late nights and stresses that come with this. As hard as their season is, and as hard as they're working, and the days are long, they seem to be pretty happy and sharing that joy of what we're building here, and it's just more and more every day. So. Invite all your listeners to get online and follow a bunch of them too, and follow us because it's what's happening in this country right now with the Northern Super League is really special, and it's because of them and for them that we're doing all of this.
That is Christina Litz, the president of the Northern Super League. Christina, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate your insights today, and of course, we'll continue to follow the league through the playoffs in your inaugural season, and let's do this again and not wait so long next time.
I'd love that. Thanks, Steve, for the opportunity.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show. As always, you can find us on Substack at gamingnewscanada.ca. This podcast can also be found on the various podcast apps and also on our YouTube channel. Thanks again to Christina Litz for joining us today, and we will see everybody again very, very soon.